Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you, Ken?
I'm well, Rory. Thanks for asking. I'm exceptionally grateful for being here. And we're really grateful that you have joined us, that you've tuned in to the Counselling Tutor Podcast and joined us for episode 195, where we're going to be covering 3 sections, starting off with our student check-in, where we're going to look at therapeutic impasse. Then we go on to focus in supervision, where we're going to look at the 7 tasks of supervision. And finally, we're going to close out episode 195, speaking about managing skepticism in when counseling clients. So if a client is skeptical about engaging in the relationship or during the relationship, and that is in our practice matters section. And that is a recent lecture that we had in our Counsellor CPD library. So we'll get there in a moment. Let's start off by that student check-in, where we speak about something that you may come across in your formal studies to become a counsellor, but we know that this section also really interesting and holds value for our qualified practitioner friends as well. Therapeutic impasse. What do we mean by that, Rory?
Well, I would say a very shorthand way of describing therapeutic impasse would be stuckness. When the client is stuck, and this can happen for a number of reasons. It may be that you have a client and all of a sudden there's no material. It's sometimes referred to in training as thin material, nothing of deep process going on for the client. And I think that certainly if you're a student counsellor with not a lot of experience, this can be quite a difficult place to be, because you're new into practice and all of a sudden the process seems to halt. And there could be many, many reasons why clients become stuck. And of course, one of those reasons is our old friend transference, where they may see you as someone from their past. And there are things to look out for here. It may be that clients are very obvious in what they say. They say things like, "You remind me of," and "Oh yes, it's just in front of you." And they say, "You remind me of," and if that's the case, then I think a therapist, counsellor should say, "Just tell me a little bit about that person you remind me of. Just think about, just tell me a little bit. How did you get on with them?" And the answer to that question will probably lead you into the reasons that they're getting stuck. "You remind me of my ex-boyfriend. You remind me of my ex-partner." And being open and honest and saying, "Well, I'm sure I may look or sound like that person, but actually I'm not." And what does it feel like to speak to me when you see part of you sees me as your ex-partner? And that can open up a real rich seam of conversation. And also, I think, define you as an individual, not as someone from the client's past.
Yeah, and I mean, that's just one area of it, looking at the transferential element that may be there. But I also recognize from my own practice, and certainly looking back to my placement days, being in the situation where I've found myself in client relationships where the client felt stuck. And it was tricky for me. And I think we're needing to look at this from the perspective of the counsellor. Early on in my practice, in placement, I felt like it was my role, it was my duty to unstick this client. And I remember feeling almost a sense of pressure. What am I going to do? What am I going to do to get this client so that they don't feel unstuck anymore? And that very process was keeping me stuck there right with the client. I was stuck with the client within this relationship, and the client, the pattern would be the same presentation week after week without any kind of direction to go in. And taking that into supervision, what I came away with, that sometimes we just recognize and verbalize with the client. It feels like we're stuck here. It feels like we're going over the same kind of things each week, and that there's no progress and just leaving that there, just saying it as it is, and saying, you know, I'm stuck here with you, and I will be here with you for as long as it takes. And sometimes being stuck is part of that process. And in recognize it, in naming that you are stuck in a certain place, it kind of hands that back to the client again. And I guess it is the client's journey. They need to lead the way, specifically in person-centered therapy, where we're kind of walking with them. They need to lead the way out of a stuck position, but we can be there with them. And as long as we can kind of focus on what kind of feelings that brings up for us, and work on those maybe in our journaling, self-development, supervision, so that we can be there. And if it calls for it, we can be there and be stuck with our client.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes I think you make a good point there. Sometimes actually verbalizing the stuckness, you know, and saying it feels like we're really both stuck here, is really useful, because, you know, that's where congruence comes in. And therapeutic impasse also speaks really strongly, I think, to diversity. So if you are, you know, every client to us is the other. Everybody is different to us, but we have to acknowledge that some clients have different cultures, different value bases, different views of the world. And if we're not culturally aware or culturally trained, we could come across as insensitive. We could have come across with an over amount of privilege, speaking from a privileged position. And I think it's really important that, you know, if we are working with clients from different cultures, different belief systems, that we are trained at least to be able to understand the obstacles and the difficulties they face in their everyday lives. And sometimes, you know, that can be something invisible to us. So, you know, I think that if you are considering being an all-round therapist, and you should be, you need to get some cultural awareness training, maybe some training around sexuality, to try and put yourself deeper in the other person's shoes, because it's all about walking in other people's shoes, isn't it?
I like that. And you know, we're looking at different areas where you may get stuck where that impasse is created, and we've recognized it could be transferential. We've recognized that it may be that we're just stuck and that the client is stuck, but we can also recognize, as you've brought up so well there, Rory, that it can be us as the counsellor that puts an invisible blockage in the journey of the client. And the truth is, the client can only go as far as we, the counsellor, can go. If we're walking with them and suddenly the client takes a step forward and we're not able to do that with them because we don't understand, we're not aligned with their frame of reference, we don't recognize and embrace them and their step forward, then suddenly they're alone and they're going to step back and be stuck, and they're going to be stuck with us. And we need to look out for that. And of course, as you've said, Rory, equality, diversity, understanding who this individual is, and being able to strip out our belief systems, our culture, our heritage, not strip it out because we are who we are, but recognizing that that is ours, and recognizing who that person is to fully be with them without them feeling valued, prized. Carl Rogers suggests therapy kind of stops there. It is one of the conditions that is essential for therapeutic development. So there is that. And of course, we're talking now about equality, diversity, but it can also be presentation based. So unless we have sharpened our competence in a certain area, if a client was to bring a topic that we had, or a presentation that we had absolutely no training, no reference, no understanding of, that's it. All we can do is recognize that they've brought that topic, but we're not able to go any further with them because we don't have the training. And I guess that illuminates how CPD helps us go further, go deeper, have more meaningful relationships with our clients.
Oh, you've hit the nail on the head there, Ken. And also, I would say that, you know, impasses can be directional. So it can be that it's the therapist that's got an impasse, that for some reason, that, you know, transferentially, they're seeing the client as someone from the past. And of course, the place to go for that is supervision. And if it is something that is really not completed, or or a part of the therapist's life that's still giving them difficulty, then obviously access to their own therapy to work through that. As a former trainer, or someone who trained counsellors in practice, I met a lot of students where impasses were generated by anxiety within the student therapist. And I think if that's the case, and it's fine, it does happen. I don't want anybody to go away thinking that this is the wrong thing or they're doing something wrong. But what is the right approach when that uncomfortable feeling happens is to take it to your training group, take it to your supervisor and explore it. And I think good supervision, getting peer support is essential if the therapeutic impasse, put my teeth in, if the therapeutic impasse comes from you.
Yeah, so a number of facets to this topic. And, if you've just gone into placement and you haven't yet reached a therapeutic impasse, you haven't become stuck with a client, then here's the thing, it's gonna come. It's gonna come. And if you're a qualified therapist, you've been practicing for some years, you're gonna recognize this. You're gonna go, oh yeah, I remember that client. It is something that we all come across during our arc of practice. So it's a good topic to have a look at. And Rory has created a super duper, absolutely free of charge handout that you can download from our website on Therapeutic Impasse. To find it is super simple. You go to counsellingtutor.com. That is our mother website. Counsellingtutor.com is where you'll find all of the information about what we put out. And right there on the page, top of the page, just click on the podcasts tab and select episode 195. That's today's episode. Right there on the page is your Therapeutic Impasse download. You just click on the button, let us know what email address to send that to, and it will be in your inbox, one of Rory's super duper handouts. So there you have it. That's our student check-in. We recognize the journey of students, and of course, Counselling Tutor, we do have a paid-for resource called the Counselling Study Resource, which has helped tens of thousands of counselling students hit their learning goals. And the actual impasse document that we're giving out today is taken directly from the Counselling Study Resource. You may have it free of charge, but if you are interested and you are a student and you want to check out our Counselling Study Resource to support you through your studies, counsellingtutor.com, all the information is right there. So moving on to our brand new section, which is focus on supervision, where we take an element of either being a supervisor or, from a practitioner's point of view, recognizing how a supervisor operates. And today, Rory, you're going to be bringing the 7 tasks of supervision for us.
Focus on supervision.
Yeah, absolutely, Ken. And this is something that comes up time and time again in our Facebook page. And if you're not a member of our Facebook page, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. You'll find us. We're a closed group. Knock on the door and we'll let you in, and you can join thousands and thousands of like-minded people, students, qualified practitioners, supervisors, a soup song of trainers, and discuss issues and practice in the world of counselling and psychotherapy. So come on in. And one of the questions that comes up is, supervision. What should it be? And Michael Carroll, a very well-known supervisor and practitioner, gave us 7 tasks of supervision, and I think it's useful just to go through them and just observe what they are. They're quite straightforward. They can be in depth, but I think in terms of a headline, just something to hold on to when you go into supervision, these 7 tasks are really useful. And the first thing to do is to create a learning relationship. A supervisor should create a learning relationship. The idea of supervision, of course, is that your supervisor is farther along the road of practice than you are, and will have had more practice experience, more client hours under their belt, probably more training. So when you come along and you're asking about a certain presentation, there's an opportunity for a supervisor to give you some education and supervision. There is a very strong educative element, and also creating that very, very rich environment for a learning relationship. So that lives, I think, in the contracting, where you're saying to Well, you're saying to the supervisor, okay, well, sometimes I may give you information, and we may look at that together, and certainly see how that fits for you, things for you to try in your practice, and then also on the counselling task. And I think, interestingly, the counselling task is exactly what you're doing. It's keeping on task. It's a really I think the counselling task is, what is counselling? So are you doing counselling, Ken? I mean, I'm sure you must have come across in your supervision practice, or generally where you've been in supervision yourself, your supervisor picking up drift where you may have been drifting off what should have been done, and what's needed. And as a consequence of that, it can be a case of a supervisor kind of bringing you back onto the road. I don't know, have you ever experienced that in your practice, Ken?
Yeah, it's certainly something that I'm recognizing from my early steps when I was in placement. I was recognizing going into supervision and recognizing how my supervisor was working with me around the counseling task. And that is, perhaps maybe, what skills are you using? How are you using those skills? When you use that skill, what difference did you see in the client, in how they were presenting? Taking in recordings to your supervisor is an example where you're outlining your counseling task, the actual process of counseling. How is that working? How effective is that? Are there other ways that we can do that? Are there other techniques that we can be aware of? Questions from a supervisor to a supervisee might be, and the client presented with XYZ. How did you respond to that? I responded like this. When you look at our theory and our skills, what were you using there? I was using X theory. How do you think that you would have done that differently if you had another bite at that cherry? And it's kind of just really focusing down onto the counselling task itself. And I think really, really important. And that's, I guess, why one of the reasons, Rory, why when you are going to train as a supervisor, you need some practice experience under your belt first. I mean, we certainly offer a advanced certificate in clinical supervision training for counsellors and therapists. And one of the requirements is at least, at bare minimum, a year's practice experience, and longer if you can. We've got some practitioners who join us after 10 years of practice. And that's a lot of practice experience that they bring, that you need to be further down that road to be able to share that with your new supervisee, specifically when you're talking about that counselling task, what tasks you're doing that represent directly to the counselling relationship.
Yeah, and I think the other aspect of the counselling task is that certainly I was taught from my very early trainings nearly 20 years ago that counselling supervision is not for personal therapy, and I think that what Michael Carroll, who's kind of written the counselling tasks, is outlining is that sometimes the personal issues of the therapist and the work can get intertwined. So a good example of that may be that a therapist brings a supervisor a client who's going through bereavement, and that's triggered the bereavement that they've had or they're going through, or it's re-triggered it, or the supervisee, the counsellor, is going through a bereavement, and their own material comes into the room. Now, how I work with that is I'm not a supervisor who just says, well, that's for your own personal therapy, we can't talk about that. I will give an amount of latitude to explore what's going on for the supervisee. However, the context of that is how it's impacting on the therapeutic relationship with the client. And if it becomes obvious, of course, that the person cannot get their own bereavement out of their head and they're only thinking about themselves in the therapy room, then of course a referral will be very, very useful here.
Yeah, and it's interesting as we cover these various aspects here. It does relate back to what we covered in episode 192. We spoke about the supervision triangle, where some of these areas are covered. And I guess what we're doing here is delving a little bit deeper, Rory.
Absolutely. And task 4, of course, is the monitoring of ethics. So, we're always looking to be ethical and to make sure that, the bottom line is that the supervisee or the counsellor that you're working with and the client are safe. That is the really important part of being a supervisor, making sure that both parties are safe and that the supervisee is working in a way that promotes safety. And I think that's really important. And, sometimes that is about pointing to ethical standards. It's about pointing to ethical standards and good practice, absolutely good practice in supervision is to look at your ethical framework, whoever code of ethics you're working at least once. I would do it once a quarter with my supervisees and say, so what does the code of ethics say about this? To remind people that, of course, it's really important to monitor ethics. And then we go on to evaluation and evaluating how it's going, and this could be formative, it could be, writing reports, that type of thing, or it could be an informal evaluation. And I'm sure, Ken, you've done a lot of evaluation with supervisees where you've saying, well, how is the client changing? What's going on for them?
Yeah, and sometimes you're called on as a supervisor to submit professional reports. So an example of that is you may have a student that is on placement that is taking supervision with you, and as part of their training requirement, they will need a report from their supervisor evaluating how they are doing, how they are working, to be able to get their professional qualification. So, and then you may be working with certain providers who require some kind of feedback, or the clients, the counsellor would need to give some kind of feedback, and you would work with that counsellor on evaluating how they are working, make it easier for them to write those reports.
Yeah, absolutely. And then task 6, consulting, and that very, very simply is bringing your experience as a supervisor into the room. And you may have a real interest in, say, something like transference and countertransference or projection. And that is where you can work with the supervisee and consult on specific areas of their practice. So this is where you're bringing in your training and your knowledge and trying to see the relationship as an ecosystem. So you're not only are you kind of teaching, but you're allowing a space for your supervisee to become curious, to ask you questions, to try things out. And I think the consulting side is really important. And we see that a lot, I think, in supervision, Ken.
We do indeed. And it brings us on to the 7th task, which is the administration task.
Yes. And I think with administration, nobody escapes paperwork at all in counselling. Anybody who thinks that there's no pen to paper or no fingers to keyboard, and administration can be, are you keeping client records? Are you complying with data protection? Are you making sure that if you work for an agency, you're working within their policies? My first question to any supervisee who's working with an agency, who asks a question about something that's happened, I say, well, what's the policy of the organisation? And if they don't know, I'll say, well, you need to ask. And occasionally they'll come back and say, well, I've asked and they haven't got a policy. And I'll say, well, maybe what you need to do is help them develop a policy for that. Yeah. Because if they haven't got one, this is a real situation and a policy is needed. And also, I think making sure that administration doesn't take too much time. Paperwork and administration tend to fill every available space that is available. So making sure that the administration that a supervisor is doing is relevant and not over the top. And there's one area there, of course, is notes. Students at the beginning of their practice write copious notes. You know, I've had students who've written literally War and Peace, pages and essays of notes. And my view is that you need to make them succinct and you need to make them factual, but you don't need to write an entire essay on every session. And that can be a bit of a relief, I find, Ken, for students who think they might need to write 3,000 words for every client.
I was looking at some of our resources recently on note-taking, and you're 100% right. And when we're looking at these 7 tasks, they are interlinking in some way. So we're speaking about administrative tasks, we're talking about note-taking. We may jump from that to task number 2, the teaching task, by working on them. So we'll check the note-taking. If they're struggling with that, then we might go into the teaching mode. And it's very similar, isn't it, in so many ways to the supervision triangle, where you're in that formative, normative, restorative areas within the triangle. And it's interesting, you could probably map the 7 tasks. If you're up for it, pop back to our previous session. I think it's 192, where we've got the supervision triangle and map the different supervision tasks. We have an advanced certificate in clinical supervision for qualified therapists who have a minimum of 1 year postgraduate practice experience. And if you're interested in having a look at that, it does also covers face-to-face, it covers online and telephone working, as well as group supervision. You can get more information from counsellingtutor.com from the homepage. It's all there for you.
Yes, absolutely.
So moving from focus on supervision right into practice matters, where we take something that's going to, relate to practicing as a therapist and managing skepticism in clients. I think this is a really, really interesting topic, and this relates to a recent lecture that was added to the Counsellor CPD library, Rory, and you met up and did an interview.
I did. I met up with Sally-Anne Armitage, who does a lot of work with emergency services personnel, and she gave a brilliant lecture on managing skepticism in counselling clients, and she gave us an overview of that lecture, and this is what she had to say.
Practice matters.
And we welcome Sally-Anne Armitage, who's done a fantastic lecture for the Counsellor CPD library on working with skeptical clients. So, Sally, you're very, very welcome.
Hello there.
Hello.
I feel famous. Ooh.
well, there you have it. And it's something that really comes up more often than people would probably imagine in the world of counselling and psychotherapy, where you're working with clients who may be a little skeptical about counselling or a little skeptical about the effects of it. So how do we help clients? How do we overcome skepticism?
Well, the reason why I did this lecture is because it comes up quite a bit in my work, because I'm a counsellor for the police force, and that's probably about maybe 30-40% of my caseload. And, you know, sort of you can get really strong, really, you know, sort of disciplined emotionally clients that, you know, they're sort of quite, how can this possibly help after everything I've been through, after everything I've experienced? How can talking about it possibly help? So you can sort of feel that skepticism as soon as you meet some of these police clients. They're obviously not all the same, but I certainly get that. And I think what really helps is to have an awareness of what's going on for me. You know, what happens for me when I'm faced with somebody who's obviously really skeptical about this work, skeptical about me. And what, you know, because the dynamic shift with every client we work with, doesn't it? I think being aware of that shift can be really useful. And I talk in my lecture about the drama triangle. You know, does it make me feel like a victim? You know, I'm really good at what I do. You know, I'm really effective. You know, does it make me feel persecuted? And I think considering stuff like that can be really helpful. So I talk a bit about that in my lecture, and also sort of being invited into an unhelpful interaction. You know, if the client says to me, "Oh, how can this possibly help?" You know, how can you possibly help? You know, if I get into that and I'm like, well, it does help. It does. It helps loads of people. You know, how does that change the dynamic? And it's just developing that awareness.
Is you talk about working with colleagues in the police service. Do you find that there's a general scepticism with a group of people who probably spend a lot of time looking at facts, evidence, things that are actually tangible? Is there any kind of gender split, or would it be a general presentation, I guess, is what I'm asking?
I think possibly I've noticed that it's more common in males than females. But like exactly what you said, that they are used to looking at stuff logically. They are used to gathering evidence, to doing things, sort of by the letter. And to be quite honest as well, in the role of a police officer, it's not always, it very seldom is a good moment to break down, a very good moment to lose your temper, a good moment to feel upset. So those feelings just get pushed to the back. So to the thought of bringing those forward and it actually being useful is really it can be quite an alien concept, I think, that it's actually a good idea to allow some of that stuff to, come into awareness and talk to me about that stuff.
Absolutely. And the paradox there is, of course, they're in therapy, so they must have come for something. So you have that paradoxical idea. Well, I'm okay, really. I can handle it. And this isn't. I'm sure. I don't want to overgeneralize about people in the police. I'm sure there are people in the police service and in every walk of life who are not like that. But for those clients who are skeptical, is it a case of addressing that paradox? The fact that, I don't want to talk about my feelings, but I'm in therapy.
I mean, quite often I think I've tried everything, so I'll try this. There's a bit of reluctance to even sort of think about it. I mean, I as a counsellor I'm a bit like, I know this gives me a lofty status, but I think I'm a bit like Yolama. I use a lot of congruence, a lot of immediacy. I'm very available and very transparent, and that works for me. And it might not work for everyone, and that's the thing with counselling, isn't it? It's finding your own way through things, which is why I've tried to keep it quite broad in my lecture. But certainly for me, being able to say to the client, I really, I can see that this is not feeling 100% comfortable. I can see that. It must be so strange to come to my, office in Marley and I'm a stranger and me to sort of invite you to tell me stuff that's really personal. That must be really strange, I can really imagine that. Is that anywhere near what you're feeling at this moment? And just being able to say that, being able to say to a client, I'm actually feeling a bit nervous because I can see that you're not sure about this, and I'm wondering what would be useful for me to say. Just being human and really warm.
Yeah, and meeting the client where they're at. Exactly. What I'm hearing is that you're recognizing in the client's frame of reference that they may be skeptical, they may be wondering what this is about. They may have preconceived ideas of what therapy is. What kind of preconceived ideas do some clients kind of share with you?
Well, I've spoken to a few that have had experiences of therapy before that have not been very positive. The one that comes through most, and please don't, if you're the sort of counsellor that does this, you stand by your guns, what works for you. But they've spoken a lot about counsellors just looking at them and waiting. And that's been really uncomfortable. Yeah. So I think it's about reading your client, isn't it? Because some clients would really respond well to that. They think, well, I've kind of got to say something, and suddenly it's quite useful to have that silence. But there's a few have had difficult experiences, and I think it's. I know it seems obvious, but I think having such a warmth and welcoming attitude makes such a difference. To sort of just be really, 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 really welcoming.
It's really interesting. You're almost talking through Roger's 6 conditions here. You're talking about psychological contact, congruence, empathy.
I mean, certainly congruence, that according to who you ask, that can be quite tricky to get, to feel confident to do that, can't it? To be able to say, I've got this thought in my head. It's quite a strong thought and it's quite a persistent thought. Now, should it come out of my mouth or should I leave it in my head? And sometimes having that micro discussion with yourself in the milliseconds of a therapy session, you know, it can take experience, and it can take practice, can't it? You know, sort of being able to do that.
Absolutely, that little auditing before immediacy. Yeah. It's not, people think immediacy is just it comes into the mind and it comes out of the mouth, and in between there's a little bit of an audit goes on to think, is this going to be helpful to the client? But you're finding by being upfront and trying to get in the client's frame of reference that can help with clients who are skeptical.
Definitely. It really does help. It really does help to rather than see it as, well, because I mean, I supervise, you see, and I supervise quite a lot of students, and there can be sort of a, well, if they're not ready, then there's nothing I can do about it. You know, if they're not ready to talk, then, you know, there's nothing that I can do. And what can happen through nerves and, you know, wanting to get it right is there's a temptation to go, oh, so I can see, have you thought about, you know, have you thought about trying this? Have you thought about trying that? Have you considered doing this? And we can sort of shift into a dynamic that's less counselling,
yes,
and more sort of, you know, other relationships, more chatting or more advice giving. So I think I keep banging on about this, but it's so important. Like, it's about being aware what is going on for me, you know, what is happening for me, and how can I best work with what's happening with me and what's obviously happening with my client.
Yeah.
I hope that's not too woolly.
No, I mean, I guess what I'm hearing is, you know, as you've said all through this interview, you've said it's about trying to meet the client where they're at, you know, in terms of maybe reluctance or skepticism, but it's also about managing your own process in that.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think we're all in this profession because we want what's best for our clients. So what's best for our clients is we try to give them an environment where it is okay to talk, you know, and that's all we want, isn't it? Where it's safe to talk and safe to talk about difficult stuff.
Absolutely. Do you think confidentiality, the idea that you know, within certain parameters, everything that's said in confidence, it helps with skepticism?
Yeah, hugely. Yeah, absolutely it does. And, you know, I've had clients in the past where I keep reiterating, don't forget, everything we talk about is just between us, you know, except the things we've talked about at the start, but everything. And it's hugely reassuring, especially for people who work as part of a large organisation like the police, where it might be that they feel a little bit observed and they feel a little bit scrutinised. You know, I'm not part of that. You know, I'm separate. This is separate. Yeah. It's confidential. I think it's hugely important.
Well, I think that's a really really useful observation. If thinking about the lecture you gave, what do you hope that people would take away from the lecture? What would you hope that people could take away and maybe use in their own practice?
What I'm hoping for is that the people who watch the lecture are invited to explore their own responses to skepticism and identify if they are perhaps leaning towards one corner of the drama triangle. And if they are, then please use supervision. You know, bare your soul to your supervisor, you know, and don't worry about doing that. And if you do feel worried about doing that, new supervisor maybe. I really do think the strong use of supervision is the backbone to our work. So find out what your responses are to clients, to skepticism in clients, and work through it and allow yourself to overcome some of the stuff, some of the interrelational issues that you might have had from the past when somebody makes you feel silly or makes you feel small or makes you feel unprofessional or whatever it might make you feel. And I've also hoped that the takeaway will be tangible advice about what you can do as well. I've put quite a bit of that in as well for people to pick and choose some options, because it's all about building your toolkit and using these little phrases, these little angles, these little metaphors to be able to connect with somebody.
Well, I've seen the lecture. There's a lot in it. I think if you are a therapist who meets in your therapy room skeptical clients, then It's a lecture not to be missed. So Sally-Anne Armitage, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much to Sally-Anne. Thank you to you, Rory, for hosting that interview. And of course, if you want to watch Sally-Anne's lecture, that is available in the Counsellor CPD library. If you are a member, just log in and it's right there on your dashboard. If you're not yet a member of the Counsellor CPD library and you are a qualified practitioner, get the information at counsellingtutor.com. Come and join thousands of like-minded therapists who use the Counsellor CPD library to sharpen their competence in service of their clients.
Yes, and what an interesting episode today. We started off with therapeutic impasse, or being stuck in therapeutic relationship, and some of the reasons and the solutions for that. We looked at 7 tasks of supervision, work by Michael Carroll, expanding on the supervision triangle and putting some detail into what supervisors need to consider when working with their supervisees. And then we finished with a fabulous interview with Sally-Anne Armitage, who talks about managing scepticism in counselling clients. And as always, stay grounded, stay safe, and hey, why not join the digital counselling revolution?
If you're a qualified counsellor or psychotherapist, then why not check out the Counselor CPD library? Stay current with your CPD requirements with over 150 hours of academically rigorous, on-demand lectures you can stream to your device. Joining Counselor CPD will expand your skill set to create a more specialised, highly rewarding practice. For more information on the Counselor CPD library, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.